She followed every rule they ever gave her. She dressed the way they told her to dress. She spoke the way they told her to speak. She smiled when they needed her to smile and stayed silent when silence was required. She did everything right, and they destroyed her anyway, not with violence, not with anger, with something quieter than both of those things, and because of that, something far more cruel. They destroyed her with politeness, with carefully turned backs and doors that were never quite opened and invitations that were always almost extended but never quite arrived. They smiled at her on Sundays and pretended she did not exist on Mondays, and by the time the winter of 1847 was over, a woman who had done nothing wrong had been erased so completely from the life of one small English town that even her name stopped being spoken aloud. That woman was someone's grandmother, and for 40 years her granddaughter Clara Whitmore lived with that knowledge the way you live with a stone in your shoe. Every single day, every single step, a small and constant reminder that something was wrong and had never been made right. Clara was a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, quiet and patient and precise in the way that people become when they have spent a long time waiting for the right moment. She had her grandmother's photograph. She had her grandmother's letter. And she had the name of the one woman still living in the town of Harrowfield, England, who had been there when it happened and had kept her silence for 6 decades. Clara saved her money. She waited. And then one gray November morning in 1887 she packed a single bag, tucked the photograph inside her coat, and boarded a coach heading north. Tonight, let this story carry you somewhere far away, to a world lit by gas lamps and governed by rules so rigid, so unforgiving, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that breaking one, even by accident, even without knowing, could cost a woman everything she had. One etiquette guide written in 1871 described society as a severe censor, pitiless and remorseless, and those were not the words of a gentle age. They were the words of a world that had decided long ago that belonging was a privilege and not a right, and that the rules separating those who belonged from those who did not would be enforced not by courts or constables but by something far more powerful. The slow, collective, unspoken agreement of an entire community to simply look away and keep looking away until the person they had chosen to erase finally disappeared. Clara had never been to England. She had never walked a cobblestone street or stood beneath a gas lamp or felt the particular kind of cold that settles into old stone buildings in the north of England in November. But she had grown up hearing about Harrowfield the way children grow up hearing about a place in a story, half real, half something else entirely, a place that exists more powerfully in the imagination than on any map. Her mother had described it in pieces over the years, always quietly, always with that particular stillness that comes over a person when they are speaking about something that still hurts long after it should have stopped hurting. A narrow high street, a church with an iron gate, a row of stone cottages at the eastern edge of town, and one cottage in particular at the very end of the row, where an old woman named Margaret Aldwell had been sitting by the same fire for 60 years. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. If you are new here, welcome to the Murmured Garden. Stay a while. Pull the covers a little closer and let the night settle around you. Because what happened when Clara Whitmore stepped off that coach and looked up at the gaslit streets of Harrowfield for the very first time was not what she had spent 40 years imagining. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was something older and slower and in the end far more lasting. The kind of truth that only surfaces when someone has been waiting long enough and has finally, gently, decided they are done waiting. The town of Harrowfield had 3 questions hanging over it the morning Clara Whitmore arrived, though nobody in Harrowfield would have acknowledged them as questions because acknowledging them would have required acknowledging that something had happened in that town worth questioning, and Harrowfield had spent 40 years carefully, collectively, successfully avoiding exactly that. The first question was the simplest and in some ways the most devastating. What exactly had Rose Whitmore done that was so unforgivable that an entire community had decided, without discussion, without vote, without a single spoken word of condemnation, to remove her from their world as completely and as quietly as a name is removed from a list? She had brought a bowl of soup to a man eating alone in the cold. That was the whole of it. That was the crime. And if you are lying there in the dark right now turning that over in your mind and finding it impossible to reconcile with what followed, then you already understand something important about the gaslit age and the kind of rules that governed it. The second question was older and in some ways more troubling than the first because it was not really about Rose Whitmore at all. It was about the town itself. It was the question that Clara had been carrying since childhood, the question her mother had carried before her and her grandmother before that, the question that sits at the center of every story about what ordinary people do when a system tells them to look away from something wrong. How does it happen? How does a street full of ordinary people, people who loved their children and tended their gardens and brought food to their neighbors in times of illness and genuinely believed themselves to be good, how do those people participate day by day, small choice by small choice, in the destruction of a woman who had done nothing to deserve it? Not through malice, not through hatred, through something far more ordinary and far more difficult to guard against. Through the simple human desire to belong, and the terror of what happens when you risk that belonging by doing what you know is right. The third question was the one that had brought Clara across an ocean on a November coach. It was the question she had not allowed herself to ask directly for 40 years because asking it directly had always felt like hoping for something she was not sure the world was capable of giving her. The question was this: was there anyone still living in Harrowfield who knew what had been done and had the courage, at the end of a long life, to say so plainly? Not to apologize. Clara had made her peace, long ago, with the understanding that apology was probably beyond what she could reasonably expect from a town that had spent 4 decades pretending the winter of 1847 had not happened. But to acknowledge, to look at what had been done in the clear light of an honest accounting and say, yes, we knew her, and yes, we failed her, and yes, she deserved better than what we gave her. That was the question. And Harrowfield, on the gray November morning that Clara Whitmore arrived on the evening coach, was a town that did not yet know it was about to answer it. The High Street of Harrowfield in November of 1887 was a study in the particular beauty of a place that has not changed in a very long time. The cobblestones were the original cobblestones, worn smooth by generations of foot traffic into a surface that caught the light in the morning in a way that was almost liquid, almost alive, the amber and gray of old stone washed clean by the overnight frost. The shop fronts were narrow and dark-windowed, their glass thick and slightly uneven in the way of old glass, so that the goods displayed behind them, bolts of cloth, loaves of bread, leather goods, ironmongery, had a slightly wavering quality, as though you were seeing them through very still water. The gas lamps that lined the street had not yet been extinguished for the morning when Clara arrived, and they burned on in the pale early light with the slightly unnecessary persistence of things that have not yet been told they are no longer needed, casting their warm amber glow on cobblestones that did not need it and making the whole street look, in that particular hour, like something from a painting of a place rather than the place itself. Above the butcher's shop at the north end of the high street, a family of starlings had built their winter roost in the gap between the chimney stack and the roof, and they moved in and out of it all morning in the quick, purposeful way of birds that have made their arrangements and are satisfied with them. The butcher himself, a large, red-faced man of about 50 named Horace Greer, whose father had been the butcher before him and whose son would be the butcher after him, a fact that Horace considered not as limitation but as a form of permanence that most people in the world were not fortunate enough to possess, watched Clara Whitmore walk past his window on her first morning with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who notices everything and says very little. He had heard about her arrival from the innkeeper's grandson the previous evening, had absorbed the information without visible reaction, and had spent the intervening hours fitting it quietly into the architecture of things he knew about Harrowfield and things he had decided, long ago, were better left undisturbed. He watched her walk past and then turned back to his counter. Outside, the starlings shifted in their roost and the gas lamps burned on and the frost on the cobblestones caught the morning light and held it, briefly, like something precious. To understand what happened in Harrowfield in the winter of 1887, you have to understand what Harrowfield was. And to understand what Harrowfield was, you have to go back further than 1887, further even than 1847. Back to the particular kind of English town that Harrowfield had always been, a town built not on industry or commerce or any single defining event, but on the slow accumulation of generations of the same families living in the same houses on the same streets and doing the same things their parents had done and their parents before them, until the town itself had become less a place than a living record of everything that had ever happened in it. Every marriage and funeral and scandal and kindness preserved in the collective memory of its inhabitants the way a tree preserves the record of its growth in the rings inside its trunk, invisible from the outside but entirely legible to anyone who knew how to look. The families of Harrowfield had been in Harrowfield so long that their names had stopped being names and had become instead a kind of shorthand for everything those families represented. The Greers were solidity and commerce and a certain blunt honesty that the town valued even when it found it uncomfortable. The Aldwells were memory and discretion and the particular authority that comes from being the oldest family in a place. Not the wealthiest, not the most powerful, but the most deeply rooted, the ones who had been there longest and whose roots had gone deepest into the particular soil of the town. The Beckles were service and reliability and the quiet dignity of people who understood that the work of keeping a community connected, delivering its letters, carrying its messages, maintaining the invisible threads of communication that held the social fabric together, was work worth doing well and worth doing without complaint. These were not the only families in Harrowfield, but they were the ones whose characters shaped the town most deeply, whose decisions carried the most weight, and whose silences in the winter of 1847 had been the most consequential. Margaret Aldwell had been born in the stone cottage at the end of the Eastern Row on a February morning in 1806, the third child and only surviving daughter of Edmund and Catherine Aldwell, who were themselves the children of Aldwells who had been in Harrowfield since before anyone could remember. She had grown up in that cottage with the particular awareness of a child who understands early that the family she belongs to carries a certain weight in the community, not through wealth or title but through something more durable and more demanding, through the expectation of conduct. The Aldwells were expected to behave well. Not merely correctly in the technical sense of following the rules, but well in the deeper sense of understanding what the rules were for and why they mattered and when they could be trusted and when they could not. It was an expectation that Margaret had spent her entire life trying to live up to and had failed. Once, in a way she had never forgotten and never forgiven herself for, though she had learned, over 60 years, to carry that failure with a quietness that looked from the outside, to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, like peace. She had been a striking young woman, not beautiful in the conventional sense of the word but striking, with those pale gray eyes that had a quality of attention so direct and so complete that people often felt, in conversation with her, that they were being seen more clearly than they entirely wished to be. She had been well read for a woman of her time and class, her father having held the somewhat unconventional view that an educated daughter was an asset rather than an embarrassment, and she had made quiet but thorough use of the library he had assembled in the front room of the cottage over the course of his lifetime. She had been engaged to be married at 23 to a young solicitor from a neighboring town, a quiet and decent man named Arthur Fenwick who had loved her with a steadiness and a patience that she had not fully appreciated until after he was gone. He had died of a fever in the spring of 1831, 6 months before the wedding, and Margaret had not considered marrying again, not because she was destroyed by grief in the dramatic sense, but because Arthur's particular quality of steadiness had set a standard she had not subsequently encountered in any other man and had decided, with the pragmatic clarity of a woman who knows her own mind, she was not willing to settle beneath. Thomas Beckel had come into the world in the same year as Margaret's engagement, 1829, the eldest son of the previous postmaster and a woman named Ellen Crane who had come to Harrowfield from a town in Yorkshire, and had brought with her a directness of manner and a warmth of disposition that sat slightly at odds with Harrowfield's general preference for careful reserve, but that the town had come to love over the years in the way you come to love a quality in someone that initially surprised you. Thomas had inherited his mother's warmth and his father's precision, which was an unusual combination and one that served him well as a postmaster. He was the kind of man people trusted instinctively, not because he was charming, though he was in a quiet way, but because he was consistent, and consistency in a person is a form of kindness that people recognize even when they cannot name it. He had grown up on the high street, had gone to Manchester at 20 to work in a counting house, had found Manchester large and loud and exhausting in a way that Harrowfield, for all its limitations, was not, and had come home at 22 to take over the post office from his father and had been there ever since, sorting letters every morning with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, reading Harrowfield's life in its correspondence the way other people read newspapers. He had been 23 years old in the autumn of 1847 when Rose Whitmore had arrived at the coaching inn. He had noticed her the way he noticed everything, carefully, without fuss, filing the observation away with the same methodical attention he gave to the letters he sorted. He had thought she seemed pleasant. He had thought, with the particular clarity of a young man who is paying attention to the world around him, that Harrowfield was treating her with a coolness that seemed, even to him, disproportionate to whatever she was supposed to have done. He had not acted on that thought. He had been 23 years old and Harrowfield had been his whole world, and the idea of stepping outside the invisible boundaries of what Harrowfield expected of him had been genuinely frightening in a way he had spent 40 years trying to honestly account for and had never quite managed to explain to his own satisfaction. Fear, he had concluded finally, was not an excuse. It was an explanation. The difference between those two things was the difference between understanding what you had done and being forgiven for it, and Thomas Beckel, in the autumn of his life, was interested in understanding and had made his peace mostly with the probability of not being forgiven. Rose Whitmore had been 26 years old when she arrived in Harrowfield in October of 1847. She had been born in a small town in Derbyshire, the second of 3 daughters of a clockmaker named Samuel Whitmore and his wife Frances, who had died when Rose was 14, leaving Samuel to raise 3 daughters with the particular combination of fierce love and practical helplessness that characterizes fathers who have lost the person who knew how to do everything. Rose had grown up helping run the household, had learned to cook and manage accounts and negotiate with tradespeople, and had developed in the process a competence and a self-sufficiency that in a man would have been called capability and in a woman of that era was called, depending on who was doing the calling, either admirable or unsettling. She had married at 22, a young schoolteacher named William Marsh who had died of consumption 18 months later, leaving her a widow with a small amount of savings, no children, and the particular freedom of a woman who has already lost the things she was most afraid of losing and has discovered, in the aftermath, that she is still standing. She had come to Harrowfield because her father's cousin had a house there and had offered her the use of a room while she decided what to do next. The cousin had died unexpectedly 3 weeks before Rose arrived, which meant she arrived to find the house already being dealt with by the cousin's solicitor and herself with nowhere to stay except the coaching inn, which she could afford for a limited time on her limited savings, and no particular connection to the town except the general understanding that her father's cousin had liked it. She had not come to Harrowfield with any agenda. She had come to Harrowfield the way people come to places in the aftermath of loss, because somewhere was better than nowhere, because movement felt better than stillness, because the future she had planned had closed and she needed to find the edges of the new one. She had brought her good dress and her late husband's books and a quality of openness that was simply her nature, the way some people are simply open to the world the way a window is open to the light, not because they have decided to be but because they have not yet been closed. The act that had undone her was so small that even now, told plainly, it requires a moment to absorb. Gerald Ashton was a man of about 40 who had been a merchant of moderate success in Harrowfield until a series of bad investments and worse judgments had reduced him to a state of embarrassment that the town had decided, collectively and without discussion, to respond to by cutting him, by withdrawing, completely and permanently, all social acknowledgement, so that Gerald Ashton walked the streets of the town where he had been born and conducted his business for 40 years as though he were invisible, which in the most socially operative sense of that word he was. Rose had not known this. She had seen a man sitting alone at a table in the cold outer room of the coaching in one evening, eating nothing, with the particular quality of stillness about him that she associated with people who are trying very hard not to be seen to be suffering. She had asked the innkeeper's wife to send him a bowl of the soup that was on for dinner. The innkeeper's wife had looked at her with an expression Rose had not known how to read and had said nothing and had sent the soup. And the following Thursday the invitation to the at-home circle had not arrived. And the Thursday after that. And the one after that. What Rose had not understood, and what nobody had explained to her because explaining it would have required acknowledging it, was that the practice of cutting in the gaslit age was not merely a social convention. It was a form of collective enforcement, a way that communities maintained their boundaries and their standards by making the cost of transgression visible and severe and communal. To acknowledge someone who had been cut was not merely a social error. It was a declaration of allegiance, a signal to the entire community that you did not share their judgment, that you were willing to place your own sympathy above the collective decision, that you were, in the most operative sense, not entirely one of them. Harrowfield had not hated Rose Whitmore. Several of the women in the at-home circle had genuinely liked her in those first weeks, had found her interesting, had enjoyed her conversation, had thought privately that she was exactly the kind of woman the town could use more of. But liking her was not sufficient protection against the machinery of the unspoken rules. And when the machinery turned, it turned on everyone in its path equally, without regard for private feelings or personal affection. You were either inside the boundary or outside it. Rose had stepped outside it without knowing the boundary was there. The months that followed were the months that Clara's family had been living with ever since, passed down through the generations in pieces, never as a single coherent narrative but as a series of impressions and images and fragments, the way traumatic histories are always passed down, in the parts that the person telling them could bear to tell. Rose's letters home to her sister in Derbyshire had become shorter and less frequent through November and December, their tone shifting from the careful optimism of someone who is having a harder time than they are letting on to something quieter and more effortful, the tone of a person who is conserving energy in the way that people do when they are no longer sure they have enough of it. Her sister had written back with increasing concern and Rose had replied with decreasing reassurance until the letters had stopped altogether in January of 1848, and her sister had written to the coaching inn and received a reply from the innkeeper that had sent her to her knees on the kitchen floor of her Derbyshire house and changed the shape of the family's grief forever. Clara had grown up with that grief the way you grow up with weather, so constantly present that you stop noticing it as a separate thing and simply experience it as the atmosphere in which everything else occurs. On the fourth day of Clara Whitmore's stay in Harrowfield, something happened that the town had not experienced in 40 years and did not know how to absorb. It happened quietly, the way most significant things in Harrowfield happened, without announcement or drama. In the pale gray light of a November morning when the frost was still on the cobblestones and the gas lamps had only just been extinguished and the high street was empty except for the baker's boy making his deliveries and a thin orange cat that lived behind the drapers and conducted its morning patrol of the eastern row with the unhurried authority of an animal that has decided it owns everything it can see. Clara Whitmore came out of the coaching inn at 7:30, turned left instead of right, walked the length of the high street without stopping, past the last of the stone cottages on the eastern row, continued past them to where the row ended and the lane became a path, and walked down that path to the door of the old Aldwell house and tried the handle. The door opened. She went inside. The baker's boy watched from the end of the lane with his basket on his arm, and his mouth slightly open, and then turned and went back the way he had come at a pace considerably faster than the one he had arrived at. The old Aldwell house had been empty for 23 years, since the death of Margaret's brother Robert, who had been the last Aldwell to actually live in it. It was a larger house than Margaret's cottage, 3 stories of dark stone with a garden that had long since gone back to something wilder and more honest than a garden, the paths between the beds having filled in with grass and the beds themselves having become the kind of dense, tangled growth that happens when plants are left to their own arrangements for long enough that they stop pretending to be decorative and start simply being alive. The house itself was structurally sound. It had been built by people who built things to last, and it had lasted, but it had the particular interior atmosphere of a place that has not been inhabited for a long time, which is not quite the atmosphere of emptiness and not quite the atmosphere of presence, but something in between. The feeling of a space that has kept the shape of the life that was once lived in it without the warmth that gave that shape its meaning. The floors were sound. The walls were sound. The fireplaces were cold and full of old ash, and the windows were filmed with the particular grime of years of weather and no one to clean them, so that the light that came through them was muted and gray and slightly golden, the way light looks through old glass that has been left to its own devices. Clara stood in the front room of the old Aldwell house for a long time without moving. She had not planned to come here specifically on this specific morning, or rather she had been planning it since she arrived without allowing herself to acknowledge that she was planning it, in the way that you sometimes approach the thing you most need to do by circling it at gradually decreasing distances until you are close enough that turning back requires more effort than continuing forward. She looked at the room with the same careful, deliberate attention she brought to everything: the cold fireplace, the bare walls where the outlines of removed pictures were still faintly visible in the slightly lighter patches of plaster they had protected from the general darkening of years, the window that looked out onto the overgrown garden and the gray November sky above it. She was looking for something she could not have named precisely, some physical evidence of the thing she had grown up knowing about, some trace in the fabric of the place of what had happened nearby in the winter of 1847. She did not find it, which was not surprising. Places do not preserve the moral weight of the things that happen near them any more than they preserve the warmth of the people who once lived in them. They simply endure. They simply stand. They are indifferent to everything that has occurred in their presence and everything that will occur after, and this indifference, Clara thought, standing in the cold front room of the old Aldwell house on a gray November morning, was either the most comforting or the most devastating thing about the physical world, and she had not yet decided which. She reached into her coat and took out her grandmother's photograph and propped it against the wall on the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. Rose Whitmore looked out from the photograph at the empty room with that expression of open, expectant curiosity that Clara had been looking at her entire life, and in the gray filtered light of the old Aldwell house the photograph looked simultaneously completely out of place and entirely correct. The way things look when they have finally arrived somewhere they were always meant to be, even if nobody planned for them to be there. Clara stepped back and looked at the photograph and the room and the cold fireplace and the window with its view of the overgrown garden and the gray sky, and she felt something shift inside her that she did not try to name or analyze but simply allowed to happen, the way you allow the end of a long-held breath to happen, not as a decision but as a relief. She stood there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she took the photograph from the mantelpiece, put it back inside her coat, and walked back out into the November morning. What she did not know, as she walked back up the lane toward the eastern row, was that she had been watched. Not just by the baker's boy, who had long since delivered his news to whoever would listen and gone about his rounds, but by Margaret Aldwell, who had been standing at the window of her cottage at the end of the row since 7 o'clock that morning with her tea cooling in her hands, watching the lane with the focused stillness of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally seen it arrive. Margaret had watched Clara walk down the lane. She had watched her try the door of the old Aldwell house and go inside. She had watched the empty lane for the 10 minutes that Clara was inside, and then watched Clara come back out and stand for a moment in the garden looking up at the front of the house before turning and walking back up toward the row. And when Clara had passed the end of the row without turning, without looking toward Margaret's window, without any indication that she knew she had been watched, Margaret had sat back down in her chair by the fire and set her cold tea on the table beside her and folded her hands in her lap and sat very still for a long time, thinking about what it meant that a woman had crossed an ocean to stand in an empty house for 10 minutes and then walk back out again with her grandmother's photograph in her coat. Thomas Beckel had heard about the old Aldwell house by 9 o'clock, which was approximately the speed at which significant information always moved through Harrowfield. Not fast, but with the particular inevitability of water finding its level, following the channels of connection and conversation that had been worn smooth by generations of use. He had heard it from Horace Greer, who had heard it from the baker's boy, and he had received the information with the same composed exterior he received all information, filing it away in the part of his mind where he kept the things that mattered and allowing nothing of what he felt about it to show on his face. What he felt about it was complex and uncomfortable, and not something he was prepared to examine in detail in the middle of his morning rounds. What he felt at the simplest level was something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific, uncomfortable sensation of being found out, not by another person but by the logic of events, by the way things tend, over enough time, to arrive at the accounting they have always been building toward. Clara Whitmore had crossed an ocean and stood in an empty house for 10 minutes and in doing so had made, without a single word, without any confrontation or accusation, without even the awareness that she was doing it, a statement about what Harrowfield owed to the truth that was clearer and more direct than anything Thomas had managed in 40 years of private guilt. The town's response to the news about the old Aldwell house was characteristic of Harrowfield at its most essentially itself. Nothing was said publicly. No one confronted Clara. No one made any visible change to the careful politeness with which the town had been treating her since her arrival. But beneath that surface, in the invisible architecture of glances and pauses and the precise calibration of warmth in morning greetings, something had shifted. The women at the drapers who had previously been merely polite became, if possible, slightly more precisely polite, in the way that people become when they are concentrating very hard on the performance of normality because they are aware that something has unsettled the ground beneath it. Horace Greer found reasons to be in the back of his shop whenever Clara walked past. The innkeeper's grandson, who had previously been professionally neutral, became slightly, almost imperceptibly warmer, which was the most interesting response of all because warmth in the innkeeper's grandson was not something that could be attributed to any explicit decision. It was simply the natural response of a young man who had not been alive in 1847 and therefore had not built the particular architecture of avoidance that the older residents of Harrowfield had spent 40 years constructing and maintaining, and who was, in the presence of Clara Whitmore, simply responding to her as a person. The afternoon of the fourth day was the afternoon that Margaret Aldwell sent her calling card. It arrived at the coaching inn at 2:30, delivered not by a footman. Margaret had not had a footman since 1860, but by her neighbor's youngest daughter, a girl of about 12 with bright eyes and cold-reddened cheeks, who handed the small cream envelope to the innkeeper's grandson with the gravity of someone who has been entrusted with something important and is taking that trust seriously. The innkeeper's grandson brought it to Clara on a small silver tray, which was the correct way to deliver a calling card in 1887, and which he had done because his grandmother had drilled into him the proper procedures for every social occasion he might encounter in the running of a coaching inn, and the delivery of calling cards was one of them, and his grandmother had been very clear about the silver tray. Clara opened the envelope and read the card inside and sat for a moment with it in her hands, and then set it on the table beside her grandmother's photograph and looked at the two objects together in the pale November light. The card read, in Margaret Aldwell's precise, almost printed hand, "Miss Margaret Aldwell will be at home on Thursday between 3 and 5 o'clock. It was Tuesday. Clara had 2 days to wait. She spent them quietly, walking the high street in the mornings, sitting by the window of the inn in the afternoons, reading in the evenings by the light of the oil lamp on her nightstand, and listening to the sounds of Harrowfield settling into its nights, the clock on the church tower marking the hours, the wind moving through the yew trees in the churchyard, the distant sound of the last coach of the evening coming in from the North Road, and the brief flurry of activity that accompanied its arrival before the town closed itself back down again into its deep, ancient, frost-covered quiet. On Wednesday evening Thomas Beckel walked the length of the high street after dark and stood outside the coaching inn for a moment in the lamplight looking up at the window of the room where Clara was staying, where the light of her oil lamp made a warm square of amber in the dark facade. He stood there for perhaps a minute, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands in his coat pockets, his face doing the thing it always did when he was thinking hard about something, going very still the way a surface goes still when the thing moving beneath it has reached its full depth. Then he turned and walked back to the post office and sat down at his desk and took out a piece of paper and wrote, for the 4th time, the opening line of his letter. This time he did not stop after the first line. He wrote for 2 hours without pausing in the same careful, precise hand he used for everything, and when he had finished he read it back once without changing anything and folded it and sealed it and put it in his coat pocket and sat for a moment in the quiet of the post office with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes closed and the feeling of a very long-held thing having been finally, irrevocably set down. Outside, the gas lamps burned on the empty high street and the frost thickened on the cobblestones, and Harrowfield slept its careful, ancient, secret-keeping sleep, as it had slept for generations, as it would sleep for generations more, indifferent to the small, significant, irrevocable things that were occurring within it on this particular November night in 1887. Thursday arrived the way days arrive in the north of England in November, not with any particular announcement, simply with a gradual, reluctant lightening of the dark that never quite achieved the quality of brightness but settled instead into the flat, pewter gray, horizonless light that was Harrowfield's default condition for 6 months of the year, and that its inhabitants had long since stopped noticing as anything other than normal. Clara woke early and lay in her bed listening to the clock on the church tower strike 6, and then 7, and then watched the light change in the window from black to dark gray to the particular shade of gray that meant morning had arrived, and decided that was enough and got up. She dressed with the same care she had brought to everything since her arrival. Her good dress, her good coat, her new wool gloves. Not because she was performing anything but because the occasion seemed to her to require a certain respect. The kind of respect you show to a thing that has been a long time coming by meeting it as well prepared as you are able. She ate breakfast at the window of the inn and watched the high street come to life in its unhurried way. The baker's boy again, the thin orange cat again, Horace Greer opening his shutters at the north end with his usual deliberate efficiency, and she thought about her grandmother in this town 40 years ago, and about what it meant to finally be here, and about the cream calling card on the table beside the photograph, and about what she was going to say to Margaret Aldwell when she finally sat down across from her in the firelit cottage at the end of the eastern row. She had been rehearsing it for 40 years. She found, sitting at the window watching the high street come to life in the gray November morning, that she had no idea what she was going to say at all, and that this felt somehow exactly right. But what no one in Harrowfield fully understood yet on that Thursday morning was what Clara's presence had already set in motion. The way a stone dropped into still water sends its rings outward long after the stone itself has settled to the bottom, touching the edges of the pond in the same quiet, inevitable, irresistible way that the truth, when it is finally allowed to move, touches everything it reaches. The calling card had been sent. The letter had been written. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of Harrowfield's conscience, in the place beneath the politeness and the rules and the 40 years of careful silence, something was shifting that had not shifted in a very long time. And it was shifting not because anyone had demanded it, but because a woman had come across an ocean and stood in an empty house for 10 minutes with her grandmother's photograph and had asked, without words, the question that the town had been avoiding since the winter of 1847. And the question, now that it had been asked, could not be unasked. It hung in the frost-cold November air of Harrowfield's high street like the smoke from its chimneys, invisible in itself but unmistakably present, unmistakably real and impossible, now that you had noticed it, to pretend you could not see. The Thursday afternoon that Clara Whitmore walked down the eastern row to Margaret Aldwell's cottage was the Thursday afternoon that Harrowfield began, very slowly and very quietly, to come apart at the seams it had been keeping carefully stitched for 40 years. Not dramatically, not visibly, not in any way that a stranger walking the high street would have noticed or been able to point to and say, "There, that is the moment the town changed." It happened the way all genuine change happens in places that have been still for a very long time. From the inside out, in the invisible architecture of private thought and private conscience, in the small but irreversible shifts that occur when people who have been looking away from something for long enough finally, for whatever reason, find themselves looking directly at it. The women at the drapers who had been watching Clara's movements all week with the careful peripheral attention of people who are trying to appear not to be watching something were watching with a slightly different quality of attention now. Not the attention of people monitoring a threat, but the attention of people who have begun, despite themselves, to be curious about what is going to happen next. Horace Greer had come out from the back of his shop. The innkeeper's grandson had found reasons to be in the front room of the inn every time Clara came downstairs. And Thomas Beckel had opened the post office an hour later than usual because he had sat at his kitchen table until nearly 9 o'clock that morning reading his letter one final time before folding it back into his coat pocket with the careful deliberateness of a man who has made a decision he is not going to unmake. Clara knocked at Margaret Aldwell's door at 3 o'clock precisely. The sound of the knock was the sound of a person who is not going to knock twice. A single clear knock of moderate force, neither tentative nor aggressive, the knock of someone who has come a long way to be at this door and is aware of both the distance and the purpose. Margaret opened it before the sound had quite finished, which meant she had been standing on the other side of it, which meant she had been ready, which meant she had been ready for longer than the time it had taken Clara to walk from the inn to the end of the eastern row. She was smaller than Clara had expected. Clara had constructed, over 40 years of imagination, a Margaret Aldwell of considerable physical presence, someone whose authority in the town was expressed in her bearing and her stature as much as in her history. The woman who opened the door was small and white-haired and very old, with those pale gray eyes that were immediately and completely arresting. Eyes that had the quality of having seen a great deal and decided to be honest about most of it. "Come in," Margaret said. "I have been waiting rather a long time." And she stepped back from the door and Clara went in. The front room of Margaret Aldwell's cottage was everything that the old Aldwell house was not, warm and inhabited and full of the accumulated presence of a life lived carefully and at length in a single place. The fire was well made, and the room smelled of coal smoke and lavender and old books and the particular sweetness of the shortbread cooling on the tin on the table between the two chairs. The bookshelves that lined the wall beside the fireplace were full of volumes that had the worn, slightly battered quality of books that have been read many times rather than displayed. Their spines faded to a uniform warm brown by decades of firelight. The window looked out onto the path where Clara had stood 2 days ago, and the view from inside was unexpectedly intimate. You could see the lane clearly, and the entrance to the old Aldwell house beyond, and the overgrown garden, and Clara understood immediately that Margaret had been watching from this window for years, possibly decades, possibly since the last time someone had stood on that path and looked at that door with any intention of opening it. She sat down in the chair across from Margaret's and accepted the cup of tea that Margaret poured without asking how she took it, which meant she had found out, which meant she had been paying very close attention. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and the fire burned between them, and the shortbread cooled on the tin, and the pale November light came through the window and lay across the floor between them like something physical, like a boundary both of them were aware of, and neither of them was quite ready to cross. It was Margaret who crossed it first. She set down her teacup with the precise, deliberate care of a woman who has been managing delicate things for so long that the management of them has become entirely unconscious, looked at Clara with those pale gray eyes, and said, "I imagine you have come about Rose." There was no uncertainty in her voice, no question in it. It was the tone of a woman stating what she already knows to be true and inviting confirmation, not because she needs it but because the conversation requires it, because you cannot begin at the middle of a thing without first acknowledging the beginning, and the beginning of this particular thing was Rose Whitmore's name, spoken aloud in Harrowfield for the first time in 40 years. Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I am her granddaughter." Margaret nodded once, the nod of a woman absorbing something she had already prepared herself to absorb, and picked up her teacup again and looked at the fire for a moment. And when she looked back, her expression had the quality of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time and has finally been allowed to be simply what it is. Not relief exactly, and not grief exactly, but something that contained elements of both and was in the end its own particular thing. The expression of a woman at the end of a long life finally arriving at the conversation she has owed someone for 40 years. What unraveled in that cottage over the following 2 hours was not the story itself. Clara knew the story, had known it her whole life in the way you know the stories that have shaped the family you were born into, but the texture of it, the specific and irreplaceable detail that only an eyewitness can provide, the difference between knowing that something happened and understanding what it felt like from the inside when it was happening. Margaret spoke without drama and without the need for response, in the measured, unhurried way of a woman who has been composing this account in her head for 60 years and has long since arrived at the version of it she can tell honestly and completely, and without the self-protective evasions that make most confessions ultimately unsatisfying. She described the Thursday-at-home circle of the autumn of 1847 with a precision that was almost architectural. Who sat where, who spoke first, what the room smelled like, what the light was doing through the windows of her mother's parlor where the circle had met in those years. She described Rose's first attendance with a warmth that had clearly not diminished in 6 decades. Rose had been funny, she said, in a quiet way, the kind of funny that requires intelligence and timing and a complete lack of self-consciousness, and the circle had liked her immediately, which had made what followed not easier but harder, because it is easier to withdraw from someone you have not liked than from someone you have. She described the week after the soup incident with the same unflinching directness. There had been no meeting, no decision. No one had said, "We will not invite her next Thursday." It had simply not happened, the way things simply do not happen in communities that have developed sufficiently sophisticated systems for collective action that they no longer require explicit coordination. The women of the at-home circle had individually and separately arrived at the same conclusion, that Rose Whitmore had made a social error of sufficient gravity to require the withdrawal of their association, and had individually and separately acted on that conclusion without discussing it, because discussing it would have required naming it, and naming it would have required examining it, and examining it might have required concluding that it was wrong. Margaret described her own role in this with the same directness she brought to everything else. She had known Rose was being cut. She had understood what it meant. She had been one of the women who had individually and separately arrived at the conclusion and individually and separately acted on it. She had been 21 years old, and she had been afraid of being cut herself, and she had not had the courage to do what she had known, even at 21, was the right thing. She said all of this plainly and without qualification and without the softening gestures of self-justification that most people employ when describing their own failures. And Clara sat across from her and listened and held her teacup in both hands and felt the warmth of it against her palms and did not speak. The fire burned lower as Margaret talked, and neither of them moved to add coal to it, and the room cooled by degrees around them in a way that neither seemed to notice or mind, as though the temperature of the room was simply not relevant to what was happening in it. Margaret described the January of 1848, the cold that year, the snow that had blocked the northern roads for 3 weeks, the particular quality of the silence from the inn that had settled over the eastern row like a second layer of frost, the morning that the innkeeper's wife had come to Margaret's mother's door with her hands twisted together and her face doing something that Margaret had not seen it do before or since, and had said only, "The young widow at the inn, Mrs. Aldwell," and Margaret's mother had said only, "Yes, I see," and had closed the door and gone to the front room and stood by the window for a long time without speaking. Margaret had been in the kitchen. She had heard the knock and the brief exchange and the closing of the door, and had understood from the sound of her mother's footsteps going to the front room. Slow, deliberate, the footsteps of a woman absorbing something heavy, that Rose Whitmore was dead. She had been 22 years old. She had sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands. She had not cried. She had sat in the kitchen with her face in her hands and felt, for the first time in her life, the full weight of what it meant to be part of something wrong, and she had understood in that moment, with the absolute clarity that comes sometimes to very young people in the moment of genuine reckoning, that she was going to carry that weight for the rest of her life. She had been right. Thomas Beckel delivered his letter while Clara and Margaret were sitting together in the cooling cottage. He slid it under the door of the coaching inn at 4:30, in the gray early dark of the November afternoon, and walked back to the post office and let himself in and stood for a moment in the quiet of the sorting room with his coat still on and his hands in his pockets and the feeling of a thing finally done settling over him like weather. He had written 3 pages. He had described the winter of 1847 from his own vantage point. The post office window from which he had watched Rose Whitmore walk the high street in the weeks before Christmas with the particular walk of someone who has not yet understood that the ground has shifted beneath them, still upright, still purposeful, still moving through the world as though it intends to accommodate her. He had described the morning he had watched her walk past and had seen, for the first time, the full reality of what the town was doing. Not in the abstract, not as a social convention being correctly applied, but as a human being systematically removed from human contact by the collective decision of the people around her. He had described not acting on what he had seen. He had described 40 years of not having acted on what he had seen. He had not asked for forgiveness, and he had said so explicitly, and he had meant it explicitly because he understood the difference between seeking absolution and bearing witness, and he had long ago decided that bearing witness was the only thing he had left to offer, and he was going to offer it completely and without reservation, or it was worth nothing at all. When Clara returned to the inn that evening and found the letter on the floor inside the door, she picked it up and took it upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and read it by the light of the oil lamp. She read it once straight through and then sat for a moment with it in her hands and then read it again more slowly. She was not surprised by its existence. She had seen Thomas Beckel through the post office window on her first morning, and had recognized in his stillness the particular stillness of a man with something he has been carrying for a long time. But she was surprised by its honesty, by the complete absence of the self-protective language that most people use when writing about their own failures, the qualifications and context settings and appeals to circumstance that transform an account of wrongdoing into something more comfortable to live with. Thomas Beckel had not done any of that. He had simply said what he had seen and what he had done and what he had not done, and had signed his full name at the bottom and put his address, and had not asked for anything in return. Clara set the letter on the table beside her grandmother's photograph and the cream calling card and looked at the 3 objects together, the photograph, the card, the letter, and felt something that she had not felt in a very long time and did not immediately recognize, and then recognized as the particular, unfamiliar, slightly overwhelming sensation of having been given exactly what you came for. The unraveling of Harrowfield's 40-year silence was not, in the end, a dramatic thing. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way silences end when they end honestly, not with a breaking but with a softening, the way frost softens in the first days of spring, not melting exactly but losing its absolute rigidity, becoming something less fixed and less cold and less certain of its own permanence. Margaret Aldwell had spoken Rose Whitmore's name aloud. Thomas Beckel had written it on 3 pages of careful, honest prose. The innkeeper's grandson had been slightly warmer than he needed to be. The women at the draper's had shifted, imperceptibly, in the quality of their watching. None of these things were large. None of them were sufficient individually to constitute the reckoning that the winter of 1847 deserved. But they were real, and they were happening. And in a town that had spent 40 years being very careful about what it allowed to be real, and what it kept carefully in the category of things that were not discussed, the simple fact of their happening was, in its quiet way, everything. There are moments in a life that you know, while they are happening, will stay with you forever. Not because they are dramatic or loud or because the world marks them in any visible way, but because something in you recognizes them as the moments around which everything else in your life has been quietly organizing itself, the way a river organizes itself around the particular landscape it has been carving for centuries without knowing it was carving anything at all. Clara Whitmore had expected, in some part of herself that she had never fully examined, that the moment of confronting Harrowfield's truth would feel like a breaking open, fierce and necessary and painful in the way of things that have been too long contained. What she found instead, sitting in Margaret Aldwell's cooling cottage with a half-empty teacup in her hands and 40 years of waiting finally at an end, was something altogether quieter and in its quietness altogether more complete. It felt like a door opening onto a room that had always been there. It felt like a window being unlatched in a house that had been closed too long. It felt, most accurately, like the end of something that should have ended 40 years ago finally being allowed to end, and the particular peace that comes not from resolution but from the simple cessation of the effort of carrying a thing you were never meant to carry alone. Margaret had been building to the center of her account for 2 hours, and when she arrived at it the same way she had arrived at everything else. Directly, without preamble, without the softening gestures that most people use to prepare both the listener and themselves for the hardest part of what they have to say. She set down her teacup and looked at Clara with those pale gray eyes and said, "There is something I have not told anyone. Not in 60 years. Not my brother, not the women of the circle, not the priest, not anyone. I have kept it because I did not know what keeping it was costing me until you walked down that lane and stood outside the old house, and I understood that the cost had been higher than I had been willing to admit, and that I was 81 years old, and if I did not say it now I was going to die with it unsaid, and that was no longer something I was willing to do." Clara set down her own teacup. The fire was very low now, and the room had cooled to the temperature of the November air outside, and neither of them had moved to address this, and neither of them was going to, because the temperature of the room was simply not relevant to what Margaret was about to say, and they both knew it. Clara looked at her and waited. In the December of 1847, Margaret said, 3 weeks before Rose Whitmore died, I went to the coaching inn. I went alone in the evening, when I knew the other guests would be at dinner and the innkeeper's wife would be in the kitchen. I went to Rose's room and I knocked on her door and she opened it and I went in. She was sitting by the small fire in her room with a blanket around her shoulders and a book open on her lap that she had not been reading, and she looked at me when I came in with an expression that I have thought about every day for 60 years, which was not the expression of a woman who was surprised to see me or angry to see me or even particularly hopeful to see me, but simply the expression of a woman who was very tired and very cold and very alone, and who was looking at another human being and waiting without expectation to see what that human being was going to do. Margaret stopped. She looked at the fire for a moment. The room was very quiet. Then she looked back at Clara and said, I sat down. I stayed for 2 hours. We talked about her husband and about Derbyshire and about the books she had brought with her and about the particular quality of the cold that year and about her plans for when the roads cleared in spring. I did not mention what the town had done. She did not mention it either. We simply talked the way 2 women talk when they are in a room together and one of them is suffering and neither of them is going to name the suffering directly because naming it directly is too hard. But they are both aware of it, and the awareness of it gives the conversation a warmth and a weight that it would not otherwise have had. I left at 9 o'clock. I said I would come again. I did not come again. She was dead 6 weeks later. And I have not forgiven myself for that in 60 years, and I am not going to pretend to you now that I have." Clara sat very still. The fire was nearly out now, and the room was cold, and the gray November dark had fully arrived outside the window, and through the glass Clara could see the gas lamps beginning to be lit on the high street, their amber light appearing one by one in the darkness like small careful acts of illumination. She thought about her grandmother in that room at the coaching inn, sitting by a small fire with a blanket around her shoulders and a book she had not been reading, opening the door to find Margaret Aldwell on the other side of it and looking at her with an expression of simple, exhausted waiting. She thought about the 2 hours they had spent together, talking about Derbyshire and dead husbands and the cold that year, and about what it must have meant to Rose to have someone in that room with her, just another human being in the room with her, not fixing anything, not naming anything, just present. And she thought about the 6 weeks after, and the cold, and the letters that had stopped, and the spring that had come too late, and she felt something move through her that was not anger and not grief and not forgiveness, but something that contained all three of those things and could not be reduced to any one of them. The feeling of a story being finally, completely, honestly told, and of the person it had been told to understanding at last the full shape of what had happened. She reached into her coat and took out her grandmother's photograph and set it on the table between them. It was the same gesture she had made in the old Aldwell house that morning, the same photograph, the same Rose Whitmore looking out from it with that expression of open expectant curiosity. But here in Margaret's firelit cottage, in the presence of the one living person who had sat in a room with Rose Whitmore and talked with her about Derbyshire and the cold and the books she had brought with her, the photograph had a different quality entirely. It was no longer simply an image. It was a presence. It was Rose Whitmore in the room with them, which was where she had always been in some sense, in the space between what had happened and what had been owed. But she was here now in a way she had not been before, acknowledged and named and seen. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. Her face had the quality that very old faces sometimes have when they are doing something they have been postponing for decades. A kind of stripped-down honesty, all the social composure gone, just the actual expression of the actual feeling, simple and clear and entirely without performance. She was a good woman, Margaret said. She was funny and she was kind and she was braver than any of us gave her credit for, and what we did to her was wrong. She said each clause of that sentence with the same weight and the same deliberateness, the way you say something you have been composing for 60 years and have finally decided to say completely and without reduction. Clara looked at her. "I know," she said. "I have always known. I came here so that someone who was there could know it too. The thing about a truth that has been kept for a very long time is that when it is finally released, it does not disappear. It does not resolve into nothing the way you might hope a burden would when it is set down. It simply changes its nature, from a weight that is carried privately to a weight that is carried together. And the difference between those two things is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything." Margaret Aldwell had carried the truth about the winter of 1847 alone for 60 years, in the cottage at the end of the eastern row, by the fire, in the chair that had taken on the shape of her stillness. And it had been a weight of a particular density and a particular cold that had not diminished over time but had simply become so familiar that she had stopped being able to feel its edges clearly. And now, in the cooling front room of her cottage on a gray November evening in 1887, with Clara Whitmore sitting across from her and Rose Whitmore's photograph on the table between them and the gas lamps coming on one by one in the dark outside the window, the weight had changed. It had not gone. It would not go. But it was no longer hers alone to carry. And that simple, fundamental, irreversible change in the nature of the carrying was what Clara had crossed an ocean to make possible. Not justice, not apology, not the undoing of what could not be undone. Simply the end of the aloneness of it. Simply the acknowledgement, spoken aloud in a warm room by a woman old enough to know the cost of silence and honest enough to pay the cost of speaking, that Rose Whitmore had been real and had been wronged and had deserved better, and that the people who had failed her had known it. Even then, even at 21, even in the grip of their fear and their conformity and their desperate need to belong. They had known it. Margaret had known it. And she was saying so now, clearly and completely and without reservation, to the woman who had come across an ocean to hear it said. It was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. Thomas Beckel read his own letter one final time that evening, standing in the sorting room of the post office with his coat still on and the letter in his hands and the sounds of Harrowfield settling into its night coming through the walls around him. He had kept a copy. He was a postmaster, and postmasters kept copies of important correspondence, and this was the most important correspondence he had ever produced. And he had known when he was writing it that he was going to keep a copy, not as a record of his own virtue, because he had none to record in this particular matter, but as a record of the truth, which was a different thing entirely and which he had decided, at 62 years old, in the autumn of his life, was worth preserving. Even when, especially when, the truth was not flattering to the person preserving it. He folded the copy carefully and put it in the drawer of his desk beneath the stamp ledger and the morning receipt book and the small framed photograph of his mother that had sat in that drawer since her death in 1871, because he could not bring himself to display it where the customers could see it, but could not bring himself to put it somewhere he could not see it either. He closed the drawer. He put on his hat. He let himself out of the post office into the cold November night and stood for a moment on the high street under the gas lamp outside his door and looked up at the sky, which was clear for the first time since Clara had arrived and full of the particular cold bright stars that appear over the north of England in November when the cloud cover breaks and the temperature drops and the world becomes briefly, breathtakingly, indifferently clear. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he turned up his collar and walked home. Clara sat in Margaret's cottage until the fire was entirely out and the cold had become genuinely uncomfortable, and Margaret had begun to look tired in the way of very old people at the end of a long day. The tiredness that is not weakness but simply the honest limit of a body that has been going for 81 years and knows its own boundaries. She stood and buttoned her coat, and Margaret stood too, slowly and carefully, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned to trust the process of standing rather than rushing it. They stood across from each other in the cold, dark room, and Clara felt the full weight of the moment. The cottage, the extinguished fire, the old woman with her pale gray eyes and her 60 years of carried truth now partially set down, the photograph of Rose Whitmore on the table between them, the gas lamps burning outside the window in the November dark. She picked up the photograph and put it back inside her coat. Then she held out her hand. Margaret took it in both of hers, the hands of a woman who had been handling delicate things carefully for 8 decades, and held it for a moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not coming with anger." Clara looked at her. "I came with 40 years of it," she said, "but I am tired of carrying it, and I have found what I needed, and I think that is sufficient." Margaret held her hand for another moment. Then she released it and stepped back and said, with the simplicity of a woman who has said all the important things and has only the ordinary things left, "Go safely." Clara buttoned the top button of her coat and walked out of the cottage and down the eastern row and up the high street toward the coaching inn. And behind her the door of the cottage at the end of the row closed quietly, and the light in the window remained on for a long time after she had gone. Clara Whitmore spent her last 2 days in Harrowfield the way she had spent her first 2. Quietly, without agenda, moving through the town at the unhurried pace of someone who has finished the thing they came to do and is now simply allowing themselves to be in the place where they did it before the place becomes memory. There is a particular quality to the last days in a place you know you are leaving. A heightened attention to detail, a tendency to look at ordinary things with the slightly slowed, slightly deliberate gaze of someone who is already in the process of preserving them, the way you look at a fire before you leave a room, not because the fire requires your attention but because something in you wants to take the warmth of it with you into the cold hallway ahead. Clara walked the high street in the mornings with that quality of attention, looking at the names above the shops and the frost on the cobblestones and the thin orange cat conducting its morning patrol and the baker's boy with his basket and the starlings in their roost above the butcher's chimney. And she filed each of these things carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things she intended to keep, understanding that she was not going to come back to Harrowfield and wanting to take as much of it with her as she was able. On the morning of her penultimate day she went to the churchyard. She had been meaning to go since she arrived, and had been putting it off with the same circling approach she had used with the old Aldwell house, approaching it at gradually decreasing distances, walking past the iron gate of the church each morning without going in, until on this particular morning she found herself at the gate without having quite decided to go to the gate, and understood that the circling had arrived at its natural conclusion, and it was time. The churchyard was old and quiet and frost-covered in the particular way of places where the sun does not reach easily, the frost lying in the shadows between the stones in a permanent, slightly blue-white layer that suggested it had been there not for a night or a week but for a season, possibly for longer, possibly since the last time the temperature had climbed high enough and the sun had been direct enough to reach into those specific shadows, which might have been years ago, which might have been never. She walked the paths between the stones slowly, reading the names and dates with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and found herself understanding in a new and physical way the depth of Harrowfield's history, the generations of the same families layered into the cold ground beneath her feet, the Greers and the Aldwells and the Beckles and all the others, going back century upon century, their names repeated and repeated in the stone until they became less like individual people and more like a single continuous presence, the accumulated weight of all the living that had been done in this particular place by these particular families over all these particular years. She found the section she was looking for in the far corner near the east wall, where the yew trees grew so thick and so close together that the light barely reached the ground beneath them and the frost had never melted from the grass between the stones. The stones here were older and simpler than the ones in the main body of the churchyard, smaller, plainer, some of them tilted by decades of frost and thaw, their inscriptions worn to near illegibility by weather and time. And among them, as she had known there would be, a section where there were no stones at all, just the ground undifferentiated, covered in the same frost-white grass as everything else, giving no indication of what lay beneath it or who lay beneath it or what stories had ended here without the dignity of a name in stone. Clara stood at the edge of this section for a long time. The yew trees were very still in the cold air, and the light was the flat gray light of a November morning, and somewhere in the town beyond the east wall a clock was striking 9, and the sound of it came over the wall and through the trees with the particular clarity that cold air gives to sound, each stroke distinct and resonant and then gone, absorbed into the silence of the churchyard the way all sounds were absorbed here eventually. The way everything was absorbed here eventually. The way the stories of the people beneath these stones had been absorbed into the ground that held them, patient and indifferent and cold, and in its cold patience somehow more honest than anything else Clara had encountered in Harrowfield. She did not cry. She had not come to cry. She had come to stand in the place where her grandmother lay and to be present in it with the full knowledge of what had happened and to allow that knowledge to be in her body, not just in her mind, in the way that grief sometimes requires, not the processed, managed, intellectually acceptable grief of a person who has spent 40 years thinking about a thing, but the raw, physical, present-tense grief of a person standing in the actual place where the actual thing happened to the actual person. She stood in the frost-white shadow of the yew trees for perhaps 20 minutes. The cold worked its way through her coat and her good dress and settled into her bones in the way of cold that has been waiting in a place for a very long time and has learned patience. She could feel the ground through the soles of her boots, solid and cold and deeply, deeply still. She thought about Rose Whitmore in her good dress in the photograph, open and curious and expecting the world to be reasonable. She thought about Rose in the room at the coaching inn with a blanket around her shoulders and a book she had not been reading. She thought about Margaret at 21 going to that room and staying 2 hours and talking about Derbyshire and the cold and then not coming back. She thought about the 6 weeks after, and the letters that stopped, and the spring roads that cleared too late. And then she thought about something she had not thought about before, standing here in the cold with the yew trees and the unmarked ground and the clock still ringing faintly in the air. She thought about the fact that her grandmother had not been alone for all of it, that there had been 2 hours in December of 1847, when Margaret Aldwell had knocked on her door and come in and sat with her and talked about ordinary things. 2 hours of ordinary human warmth in a winter of cold. It was not sufficient. It was nowhere near sufficient. But it was real. It had happened. And standing here in the churchyard with the frost on the ground and the yew trees closing out the light, Clara decided that it mattered. She left the churchyard at 9:30 and walked back up the high street in the thin winter sunlight that had appeared briefly between the clouds, casting long pale shadows from the shop fronts across the cobblestones in a way that made the street look simultaneously familiar and slightly unreal, like a street in a dream that is almost the street you know but not quite. She bought a cup of tea at the small shop near the drapers and sat at the window and watched the town in the thin sunlight and thought about Pennsylvania and about the classroom where she had been teaching for 20 years and about the children she would see when she returned and about the letter she was going to write to her sister when she got home and about how she was going to begin it. She had no idea how she was going to begin it. She thought that she would probably sit down at her desk and look at the blank page for a long time and then write something that was not quite what she meant and cross it out and try again and eventually arrive, by the same process of circling approach that she apparently applied to most important things. At the beginning, that was actually the beginning. She finished her tea and left a coin on the table and walked back to the inn in the thin pale sunlight and went upstairs and began, slowly and carefully, to pack her bag. She visited Margaret one final time on the morning she left. She had not sent a calling card. She simply walked to the cottage at 7:30 with her bag already waiting at the inn, and knocked at the door, and Margaret opened it with the expression of a woman who had been expecting her, which was the expression Margaret wore whenever Clara arrived, as though Clara's movements were simply part of the logic of events that Margaret had long since worked out and was simply waiting for reality to catch up with. "Come in," Margaret said, and Clara went in for the last time and sat in the chair across from Margaret's and accepted the cup of tea, and they sat together in the warm cottage with the fire well made and the winter light coming through the window and the town beginning its day outside on the high street, and they talked, as they had talked on her last visit, about ordinary things. They talked about the weather, which was changing and promised to be milder for the journey south. They talked about Pennsylvania, which Margaret had read about in a book of travels published in 1860, and which she understood to be a place of considerable natural beauty and extreme winters, both of which Clara confirmed. They talked about teaching, about the particular rewards and particular difficulties of spending your days in the company of children who are in the process of becoming whoever they are going to be, and Margaret said that she thought it must be the most important work there was, and said it with the conviction of a woman who had spent 81 years watching people become who they were, and had strong views about the conditions under which that becoming was most likely to go well. Clara thought she was probably right. They finished their tea. The fire burned steadily. Outside the window the high street was fully alive now in the pale morning light. The shops open. The cobblestones busy with the ordinary morning traffic of a small English town going about its business in the particular unhurried way of a place that has been going about its business in this same street for a very long time and expects to continue doing so for a very long time more. When Clara stood to leave, Margaret reached out and took her hand, as she had done before, and held it for a moment. She was very small and very still, and her hands were the hands of someone who had been holding things carefully for a long time and had not yet decided to stop. "Go safely," she said. And then, after a pause that had the quality of something that has been considered for a long time before being spoken, "Tell them she was remembered." Clara looked at her. "Tell who?" she said. Margaret looked back at her with those pale gray eyes that had the quality of having seen a great deal and decided to be honest about most of it. "Tell whoever needs to know," she said. "Tell them that Rose Whitmore was remembered in Harrowfield. That there was at least one person here who remembered her and who was sorry and who thought of her every single day and who hoped that she had known, in those 2 hours in December, that she was not entirely alone." Clara held Margaret's hand for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she released it gently and buttoned her coat and walked out of the cottage for the last time and down the eastern row and up the high street to the coaching inn without looking back, and behind her the cottage door closed quietly and the light in the window remained on and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up in the still cold air, and the town of Harrowfield went about its morning in the pale November light as though nothing of particular significance had occurred within it in the past week, as towns always do, as towns always have, the surface of daily life closing smoothly over the deeper disturbances beneath it the way cold water closes over a stone. The coach left Harrowfield at 8:30. It moved north through the frost-white countryside at the steady pace of a vehicle that has made this journey many times and sees no reason to hurry it. the horses finding their rhythm on the cold road with the unhurried competence of animals that know their work, the wheels turning on the frozen ground with a sound like the turning of something very old and very patient. Clara sat by the window and watched Harrowfield recede. The high street, the church tower, the rooftops, the particular profile of the landscape around the town, the fields pale and flat under the gray sky, the yew trees in the churchyard visible above the east wall for a moment and then gone behind a rise in the road. She had her grandmother's photograph in her coat. She had Thomas Beckel's letter in her bag. She had the memory of Margaret Aldwell's hands and Margaret Aldwell's voice saying Rose Whitmore's name aloud in a room where it had not been spoken for 60 years. She had the memory of the unmarked ground in the shadow of the yew trees, and the frost that never melted there, and the clock striking 9 over the east wall with its clear, cold resonance. She had 2 hours of ordinary warmth in a long, cold winter, which was not sufficient and which was not nothing. She had all of these things, and she held them carefully, the way you hold things that are both heavy and fragile. As the coach moved north through the frost-white countryside and Harrowfield disappeared behind the rise in the road and was gone. The journey south took 2 days. Clara spent them watching the countryside change outside the window, the flat northern fields giving way gradually to softer, more rolling country, the gray November sky unchanging above all of it. The small towns and villages they passed through, each with their own particular character, their own particular stillness, their own particular arrangement of the same elements that all English towns were made of in 1887. Stone and glass and coal smoke and gaslight and the invisible, intricate, endlessly maintained architecture of social convention that held each community together and apart from all the others in precisely calibrated degrees of warmth and distance. She thought about rules. She had been thinking about rules since she arrived in Harrowfield, and she thought about them now with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a week inside a system and can see both its necessity and its cost with equal plainness. Rules were not nothing. Rules were what made it possible for communities to exist, for people to live alongside each other in the close proximity that towns required without the friction of constant negotiation and renegotiation of every boundary and expectation. But rules were tools, and tools were only as good as the purposes they served and the hands that wielded them, and when a rule was wielded in service of cruelty or cowardice or the simple human desire to make the discomfort of a conscience go away by making the person causing that discomfort disappear, then the rule had ceased to be a tool for human flourishing and had become something else entirely. She arrived back in London on the second evening and spent one night in a hotel near the station before boarding the ship the following morning. The ocean crossing took 9 days. She spent them in the particular suspension of a sea voyage, neither in the place she had left nor the place she was going, the ship moving through the gray November Atlantic at a pace that felt, from the deck, imperceptible, but that the miles steadily accumulating behind them made real. She read. She walked the deck in the cold salt air in the mornings. She wrote in the small notebook she always carried, not the letter to her sister, which she was not ready to write yet, but notes, impressions, details she wanted to preserve. The quality of the light in Harrowfield in November, the sound of the clock over the east wall of the churchyard, the specific amber of the gas lamps on the wet cobblestones at night, the warmth of Margaret Aldwell's cottage compared to the cold of the room outside it, the weight of Thomas Beckel's letter in her hands. When she first read it, the feel of the frost-cold ground through the soles of her boots in the shadow of the yew trees. She wrote these things down carefully in her small notebook and then closed it and put it in her bag and stood at the rail of the ship and watched the gray Atlantic moving under the gray sky and felt the wind on her face and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing she had not been able to do for a very long time and which felt, standing at the rail of the ship in the cold Atlantic wind, like a form of rest she had not known she needed. Pennsylvania in December was cold in a different way from Harrowfield in November. A bigger, more open cold, without the particular enclosed quality of a cold that has settled into old stone over centuries. A cold that came from the sky and the wind rather than from the ground and the walls. Clara arrived home on a Tuesday afternoon to find her house exactly as she had left it. The fire laid but not lit, the curtains drawn, the desk in the study with her papers exactly where she had left them. And she went through the rooms lighting fires and opening curtains and making tea with the automatic competence of a person returning to a familiar space after an absence, and the house gradually warmed around her and the familiar smells of it came back. Old wood and paper and the particular smell of the soap she used and the faint ghost of last summer's lavender in the dried arrangement on the hall table. And she felt the house receive her back in the way that houses receive their inhabitants back after absences, without ceremony, without comment, simply with the resumption of warmth. She sat at her desk that evening with a cup of tea and her grandmother's photograph and Thomas Beckel's letter and her small notebook and the cream calling card from Margaret Aldwell, which she had kept without fully deciding to keep it but which she had not thrown away. She arranged these things in front of her on the desk and looked at them for a long time. Then she opened her notebook to a clean page and took up her pen and wrote at the top of the page, in her careful schoolteacher's hand, Rose Whitmore, 1821 to 1848. Remembered. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she wrote beneath it, she was funny and she was kind and she was braver than any of us gave her credit for. She was not alone in December of 1847. She is not alone now. She set down her pen and looked at the page and felt something that she thought might be, if not the end of grief, then at least the beginning of the end of it, the particular shift that occurs when a thing that has been carried as a burden begins to be carried instead as a story, which is a different kind of carrying, lighter, the difference between a weight that diminishes you and a weight that is part of you, that has made you what you are, that you carry not because you have no choice but because it belongs to you and you have decided to honor it by keeping it close. Outside the window of her study, the Pennsylvania night was cold and clear and full of stars, different stars from the ones Thomas Beckel had stood under on the Harrowfield High Street, but the same sky, the same cold, the same indifferent and beautiful darkness that lay over everything in November, over the frost-white fields of northern England and the cobblestoned high streets of small English towns and the gray Atlantic and the Pennsylvania countryside alike, without preference, without judgment, without the least concern for the human stories being lived beneath it. Clara looked at the stars through the window for a moment and then looked back at the page with Rose Whitmore's name on it, and then closed her notebook gently and set it on the desk beside the photograph and the letter and the calling card and picked up her cup of tea and held it in both hands and felt the warmth of it against her palms the way she had felt the warmth of her teacup in Margaret Aldwell's cottage, which was the way her grandmother had presumably felt the warmth of the bowl of soup she had sent to a man eating alone in the cold, which was the way warmth always felt when you were cold and someone offered it to you, like the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in the world at exactly the same time. The town of Harrowfield settled into its December in the days after Clara left. The weather turned milder as it sometimes did in the north of England in early December, the hard frost giving way to a softer dampness that lay over the town in a low gray mist in the mornings and cleared by mid-afternoon to a pale thin light that was almost kind. The high street went about its business as it always had. The baker's boy, the thin orange cat, Horace Greer opening his shutters at the north end with his usual deliberate efficiency, the women at the drapers conducting their careful social calibrations, the clock on the church tower marking the hours with its clear cold chime that carried over the rooftops and into the churchyard and over the east wall to wherever sounds go when they have finished being sounds. Margaret Aldwell sat in her chair by the fire on her Thursday afternoons and received her at-home callers with the same composed attention she always had, serving the same shortbread from the same tin, listening to the conversations of Harrowfield with the same careful, peripheral awareness. But something had changed. Something small and invisible and entirely internal, the way the most significant changes always are. A slight lessening of the particular tension that had lived in her shoulders for 60 years, a slight softening of the quality of silence in the cottage on the evenings when she sat alone with her fire and her books. Not peace, not quite peace, but the beginning of the approach to it, the beginning of the possibility of it, which was, at 81, more than she had expected and more than enough. Thomas Beckel sorted his letters every morning with the same unhurried attention he always had, his hands moving through the envelopes with the automatic competence of 30 years of practice, his mind doing the quiet parallel work it always did, noting, cataloging, filing, the continuous low-level reading of Harrowfield's life in its correspondence that was simply the texture of his days. But the drawer beneath the stamp ledger now contained, alongside his mother's photograph and the morning receipt books going back a decade, a folded copy of the most important letter he had ever written, and he was aware of its presence there in the way you are aware of a thing that has been done and cannot be undone, which is not always a comfortable awareness but is always, eventually, a clarifying one. He was 62 years old. He had perhaps 20 years left if he was lucky, and the weather was kind and his body continued to do what it had been doing. 20 years was enough time to do something with what he had learned. He was not sure yet what that something was. He thought he would know it when he saw it. He thought he would recognize it the way he had recognized the need to write the letter, not as a decision exactly but as the arrival of a thing that had been building toward arrival for a long time, simply making itself finally undeniable. The old Aldwell house stood at the end of the lane as it had always stood, 3 stories of dark stone with its overgrown garden, and its filmed windows and its cold, empty rooms. But someone had been in it. The door opened now with a smoothness it had not had before, as though the handle had been used recently, as though the hinges had been reminded of their purpose. And on the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace in the front room, if you looked very carefully in the particular filtered light that came through the filmed windows on a gray December morning, you could see a very faint rectangular outline in the dust where something had rested briefly. Something approximately the size and shape of a small photograph, propped against the wall, looking out at the empty room with whatever expression it had carried, for however long it had been there before the person who had brought it had taken it away again and carried it home across an ocean. The outline in the dust was a small thing. It was a temporary thing. The next time the light shifted or the temperature changed or someone walked through the room, the dust would move and the outline would be gone. But it was there now, in the December morning light of the old Aldwell house, faint and clear and entirely real. The trace of a presence in a place that had been empty too long. The mark of a woman who had come a long way to stand in a room for 10 minutes with her grandmother's photograph and had left, without intending to, the lightest possible evidence that she had been there. The gas lamps on Harrowfield's High Street were lit every evening at dusk by the same lamplighter who had been lighting them for 15 years. A quiet man of about 40 named William Croft, who walked the length of the street from north to south with his long pole and his steady, unhurried pace, touching the flame to each lamp in turn with the practiced ease of someone who has performed the same action so many times that it has become completely unconscious, a thing the hands do while the mind is elsewhere. He had been lighting the lamps on the Harrowfield High Street since before Clara Whitmore arrived, and he lit them the evening she left, and he went on lighting them in the days and weeks after, the amber light appearing on the cobblestones each evening at the same hour in the same sequence, north to south, the way it had appeared every evening for years. The light was the same. The cobblestones were the same. The smoke from the chimneys was the same. The frost was the same. And yet something in the town was different, in the invisible way that things are different when a truth that has been kept for a long time has been spoken aloud and cannot be unspoken, when a name that has not been said has been said and cannot be unsaid, when the weight of a collective silence has shifted, even slightly, even incrementally, from the place it has occupied for decades into a slightly different configuration that is not resolution and is not repair but is at least honest, which is the beginning of both of those things and may be, for now, sufficient. The nights in Harrowfield in December were long. They began before 4 o'clock in the afternoon and lasted until well past 7 in the morning. The darkness pressing down on the town from all sides with the patient insistence of something that knows it has the longer season and is not in a hurry. The gas lamps made their amber islands in the dark, and the fires made their amber squares in the windows, and between these small warm lights the cold dark held everything in its December grip. The cobblestones and the shop fronts and the church tower and the yew trees in the churchyard and the unmarked ground in the shadow beneath them and the eastern row and Margaret Aldwell's cottage at the end of it and the old Aldwell house beyond, all of it held in the same cold dark, all of it patient, all of it enduring, all of it carrying in its stones and its soil and its air the accumulated weight of everything that had ever happened in it, and everything that had been said and everything that had not been said and everything that had been carried alone and everything that had finally, on a gray November week in 1887, been set down or at least shifted, lightened, shared. The winter deepened around Harrowfield in the way that winters deepen in the north of England. Not all at once, not with any single dramatic shift, but gradually and thoroughly and without apology. The cold working its way into the stones of the buildings and the ground beneath the streets and the bare branches of the trees in the churchyard until the cold was not something the town was experiencing but something the town had become, the way a place becomes its weather when the weather stays long enough and the people within it stop distinguishing between the temperature outside and the temperature inside themselves. The days shortened past the point of comfort and then past the point of adequacy and settled into the brief, gray, insufficient light of the English December solstice, for hours of pale illumination between long darknesses, the sun appearing low on the southern horizon like something that has almost given up and then disappearing again before anyone had quite finished appreciating it. The gas lamps burned longer each day. The fires in the cottages and the shops and the coaching in burned higher. And Harrowfield drew itself inward, the way small towns draw inward in deep winter, becoming more itself, more concentrated, more entirely occupied with the business of simply continuing. Margaret Aldwell rose each morning at 6 o'clock, as she had risen at 6 o'clock every morning for as long as she could remember, and went through the same sequence of small necessary actions that constituted the beginning of her day. The fire, the kettle, the tea, the bread that she had learned to bake in this same kitchen 60 years ago, and had been baking ever since with the automatic competence of something so deeply learned it had ceased to require attention. She moved through the cottage in the early morning dark with the unhurried certainty of a woman who knows every inch of her own space so thoroughly that the darkness offers no inconvenience. Her hands finding what they needed without her eyes needing to confirm it. The kettle on its hook, the bread tin on its shelf, the chair by the fire in its place, always in its place, the place it had occupied for so many decades that the floorboards beneath it had taken on the slightly worn quality of boards that have been stood on and sat near and risen from and returned to many thousands of times. She sat in the chair with her tea and watched the fire come up from the coals she had banked the night before and felt the day settle into its shape around her. And on many of these mornings now, in the weeks since Clara had gone, she found herself thinking about Rose Whitmore not with the quality of weight she had always associated with that thinking but with something slightly different, something she was still in the process of identifying. Not lighter exactly, not resolved, something more like honest. The way a thing feels when you have finally stopped pretending it is something other than what it is. She had not told anyone else. She had considered it in the days after Clara left, had sat in her chair by the fire on several evenings and thought carefully about what it would mean to speak, to the women at the at-home circle or to the priest or to anyone, the truth about the winter of 1847 and her own part in it. She had concluded, after careful thought, that the speaking she had already done was the speaking that mattered. She had spoken to Clara. Clara was the person to whom it had been owed. The rest of the town was a different question, a question about Harrowfield's relationship with its own history, which was not Margaret's to resolve alone, which would resolve itself or not resolve itself in the fullness of time, which was not her responsibility to force. What was her responsibility was what she had done, and she had done it. She had spoken Rose Whitmore's name to the woman who had come across an ocean to hear it spoken. She had said what she had needed to say and had said it completely and without evasion and had felt, in the saying of it, something shift inside her that she did not think was going to shift back. That was enough. That was, she had decided. Sitting in her chair by the fire on a December evening with the frost thickening on the window and the town settling into its night around her. Enough. Thomas Beckel had begun to do something he had not done in years. He had begun, in the early mornings before the post office opened, to write. Not letters. He had written enough letters, the most important of which was now in a drawer in Pennsylvania in the keeping of a woman who would know what to do with it. Something else. Something he did not have a clear name for yet, which he thought of provisionally and without particular attachment as an account, meaning simply a truthful record of what he had seen and known and not done over the course of a life lived in a particular place at a particular time. He wrote in a small notebook at the kitchen table before the light came up, by the light of an oil lamp, in the same careful hand he used for everything, and he wrote without plan or destination, simply following the thread of memory wherever it led, back through the 31 years of the post office, back through the brief Manchester years, back through the childhood on the high street with his mother's directness and his father's precision making the particular compound of his character. Back to the autumn of 1847 and the things he had seen through the post office window and the things he had done with what he had seen, which was nothing, which was the part he wrote about with the same unflinching directness he had brought to the letter, because he had decided that the only version of the account worth writing was the honest one, and that the honest one required him to look at the failure of 23-year-old Thomas Beckel with the same clear eyes he would have brought to the failure of anyone else, which meant without excuse and without minimization and without the gentle retrospective self-forgiveness that most people apply to their younger selves as a matter of course. The coaching inn on Harrowfield's High Street was quieter in December than in the traveling months. The volume of coaches reduced and the rooms less frequently occupied and the particular atmosphere of the place shifting from the busyness of a transit point to something more settled and self-contained. The atmosphere of a building that has temporarily stopped being in the middle of things and has returned to simply being itself. The innkeeper's grandson, whose name was Daniel and who had been managing the inn for 3 years since his grandmother's retirement, and who was 26 years old and had grown up in the inn the way some children grow up in churches or shops, surrounded by the particular rhythms of the family business until those rhythms have become indistinguishable from the rhythms of life itself. Daniel had been thinking about Clara Whitmore since she left. Not in any complicated or sentimental way. Simply in the way you think about a person who has come through a place you know well and has seen it differently from the way you see it and has left you wondering whether the way you see it is the only way or simply the way you have always seen it, which is a different thing. He had grown up knowing that there was something in the town's history that the older residents did not discuss. He had filed that knowledge away in the category of things that adults kept from children and had never thought to retrieve it. Clara Whitmore's presence had retrieved it. He was not sure yet what he was going to do with what it contained. The yew trees in the churchyard did not change with the season the way the other trees changed. They had been dark and dense in autumn, and they were dark and dense in December, and they would be dark and dense in spring. Their particular darkness a constant in the churchyard's landscape that made everything else's change more visible by contrast. The frost beneath them was the same frost that had been there since October, undisturbed and permanent in the shade, and the unmarked ground in the far corner near the east wall was the same unmarked ground it had always been, neither more nor less attended to than it had ever been. The grass between the frost-white tufts the same pale winter grass that covered the rest of the churchyard. Nothing had changed here. Nothing visible had changed here. But Clara Whitmore had stood in this corner for 20 minutes on a November morning, and the ground that had received no particular attention for 40 years had received attention, and the attention had been given by someone who knew whose ground it was, and that knowing had been real, and it had happened, and it could not be made to not have happened, and in some way that was not visible and not measurable and not in any way registrable by the churchyard or the yew trees or the frost-white grass. It mattered. It had always mattered. Clara had simply come to confirm that it did. The shortbread that Margaret made every Thursday for the at-home circle was made from a recipe that had been in her family for 4 generations. Her great-grandmother's recipe, written in faded ink in a small notebook that lived in the kitchen drawer alongside the other household records, the accounts and the menus and the lists of provisions going back decades. She made it the same way every time, measuring by habit and experience rather than by the written quantities. Her hands knowing the proportions the way they knew everything they had been doing for 60 years, with a sureness that required no verification. She made it on Wednesday evenings, cutting the dough into the same shapes she had always cut it, pressing the tines of a fork into each piece in the same pattern, sliding the tin into the range with the same practice timing. The smell of it baking filled the cottage on Wednesday evenings the way it had filled the cottage every Wednesday evening for 60 years, sweet and warm and particular. The smell of something so thoroughly known that it had ceased to be simply a smell and had become instead a kind of presence. The presence of all the Wednesday evenings it had accompanied, all the Thursday mornings it had preceded, all the at-home afternoons it had attended, all the small social rituals of a life lived carefully in a single place over a very long time. Margaret sat in her chair by the fire on the Wednesday evenings while the shortbread baked and listened to the sounds of the cottage around her. The range, the fire, the wind outside if there was wind, the silence if there was not, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the thing she had always been best at and which she was finding, in the weeks since Clara's visit, came more easily than it had in a long time. Clara's letter arrived in Harrowfield on the 15th of December, addressed in her careful schoolteacher's hand to Miss Margaret Aldwell, Eastern Row, Harrowfield, and delivered by Thomas Beckle himself, who recognized the handwriting on the envelope from the address she had given him at the bottom of his own letter, and who carried it the length of the High Street and down the Eastern Row and knocked at the cottage door, and handed it to Margaret with a quietness that communicated, without any words being necessary, that he knew what it was and that the delivering of it was something he had wanted to do himself rather than leaving it to the mechanics of the morning round. Margaret took it from him and looked at it for a moment and then looked at Thomas and said simply, "Come in, then, if you would like to know what it says." It was the first time in 40 years that Thomas Beckle had been inside the Aldwell cottage. He sat in the chair that Clara had sat in, across the fire from Margaret's chair, and Margaret opened the letter carefully and read it aloud in the quiet of the cottage with the fire between them and the December morning gray and still outside the window. Clara had written 3 pages. She had written about the journey home, the coach south, the London hotel, the ship, the 9 days of Atlantic gray, and about arriving back in Pennsylvania to find the house cold and the fires unlit and the familiar smell of it coming back to her as the rooms warmed. She had written about sitting at her desk with her grandmother's photograph and Thomas's letter and the cream calling card arranged in front of her. She had written what she had written in her notebook, Rose Whitmore 1821 to 1848, remembered, and had written it again here in the letter so that Margaret would know. She had written about returning to the classroom and the particular comfort of the children's faces, and the way the ordinary business of teaching had resumed around her with the same unhurried continuity that she had found, she realized, in Harrowfield itself. The sense of a life that has been going on for a long time and intends to go on for a long time more. She had written near the end, "I came to Harrowfield with 40 years of a story I had been told in pieces. I am going home with the whole of it. I do not know yet what I will do with the whole of it. I think I will simply carry it differently. I think that is what you gave me." She had signed it Clara Whitmore, and beneath her name she had written, in slightly smaller letters, "Granddaughter of Rose." Margaret read the letter through to the end and then folded it carefully and held it in her hands for a moment and then looked across the fire at Thomas, who had been listening with his hands folded in his lap and his face doing the thing it did when he was feeling something deeply and had decided to feel it without comment. The fire crackled between them. Outside the window the eastern row was quiet in the December morning. The frost on the path, the bare garden of the old Aldwell house visible beyond the end of the lane, The sky above it the particular pale gray of a December sky that has not yet decided what it intends to do with the day. Margaret set the letter on the table beside her teacup. Thomas looked at it for a moment and then looked at Margaret. "She carries it differently now," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "I think she does." They sat together in the quiet of the cottage for a little while longer, not talking, the fire burning between them, the December morning doing whatever December mornings in Harrowfield had always done, which was proceed at their own pace in their own way without reference to anything that the people within them needed or wanted, simply being what they were, which was cold and gray, and in their cold grayness somehow sufficient, somehow exactly what the day required, somehow the right weather. For a morning on which two old people sat by a fire and thought about a young woman who had come a long way to say something that needed saying and had gone home carrying the answer she had come for. The days between Christmas and the New Year were the quietest days in Harrowfield's year. The town stripped back to its essential self, the social rituals temporarily suspended, the high street hushed in the mornings, the coaches less frequent, the shopkeepers spending more time in the back rooms of their shops and less time at their counters. It was a time of year that Harrowfield had always used, without particularly articulating this to itself, for a kind of private accounting, the taking stock that people do at the year's end, the quiet consideration of what had happened and what it meant and what the year ahead might require. Margaret sat by her fire through these days with her books and her tea and her thoughts and felt the year of 1887 settle into the past the way all years eventually settled. Not cleanly, not completely, but with the particular finality of something that has been used up and can now only be remembered. It had been a year that had contained something she had not expected and had not known she needed. A knock at the door. A woman with her grandmother's face. A conversation she had been composing for 60 years and had finally been given the occasion to deliver. She was 81 years old. She did not know how many years she had left. She thought that however many they were, they would be carried differently than the years before, lighter in the way that Clara had described. The difference between a weight that diminishes and a weight that belongs, and she was grateful for that difference in the way that very old people are grateful for things, completely without reservation, without the complicated qualifications that younger people attach to their gratitude because they still expect more and are still capable of being disappointed. She was grateful. That was the whole of it. She was grateful and she was tired and the fire was warm and the night outside the window was very still and very dark and very cold and entirely, deeply, peacefully beautiful in the way of all things that have been what they are for a very long time and intend to go on being it. The new year came to Harrowfield as it always came, quietly in the dark, without ceremony beyond the brief ringing of the church bells at midnight that carried over the frost-white rooftops and into the sleeping rooms of the town and was absorbed into the dreams of its inhabitants and was gone by morning, leaving only the new number on the calendar to indicate that anything at all had changed. The high street resumed its rhythms. The baker's boy resumed his rounds. The thin orange cat resumed its morning patrol of the eastern row. Horace Greer resumed his opening of the shutters at the north end of the high street at the same hour he had always opened them, with the same deliberate efficiency, his large hands working the latches with the practiced ease of 30 years of the same action. The women at the drapers resumed their careful social calibrations. The coaching inn resumed its modest winter trade, and Thomas Beckel resumed his letter sorting every morning, his hands moving through the envelopes with the automatic competence of long practice, reading Harrowfield's life and its correspondence the way he had always read it, with the same careful, peripheral awareness that was simply the texture of his days and always had been. But in the drawer beneath the stamp ledger there was a folded copy of a letter, and in the kitchen at the back of the post office there was a small notebook filling slowly with a careful, honest account of a life, and these things were new, and they changed the quality of the sameness around them in the way that new things always change the quality of sameness. Not by making the sameness less, but by giving it a context it had not previously had, a before and an after, a reason for its continuity that was not simply the absence of change but the active, chosen, deliberate continuation of something that had been examined and found worth continuing. Thomas Beckles sorted his letters. The morning light came through the post office window the way it had always come, flat and gray and indifferent and entirely sufficient. He sorted the letters and thought about what he was writing in the small notebook and about what Clara Whitmore was doing in Pennsylvania on this particular January morning, and about what Margaret Aldwell was doing in the cottage at the end of the Eastern Row, and about Rose Whitmore in the winter of 1847. And he thought about all of these things in the same careful, unhurried way he thought about everything, and outside the window the high street of Harrowfield went about its business in the January cold, and the gas lamps burned on in the gray morning light, and the starlings moved in and out of their roost above the butcher's chimney, and the frost on the cobblestones caught what light there was and held it briefly, the way it always had, the way it always would. In Pennsylvania, Clara Whitmore was teaching. She stood at the front of her classroom in the January cold with the pale winter light coming through the high windows and the faces of her students looking up at her with the particular quality of attention that children bring to things when they are genuinely interested rather than merely present. And she taught them the things she had always taught them, reading and writing and arithmetic and the slow, careful, infinitely patient practice of paying attention to the world and trying to understand what it is telling you. She had been a teacher for 20 years and she had always loved it with the specific, practical, unsentimental love of someone who has found the work they were made for and has stopped needing to justify that love or examine its origins. She loved the children's faces. She loved the moment when something difficult became clear to someone who had been struggling with it, the way the face changed in that moment, opening like a window in a room that had been closed. She loved the ordinary dailiness of it, the same classroom, the same rhythms, the same beginning and ending that gave the days their shape. She had come back from England carrying something she had not carried before, and it sat with her now in the classroom. Not intrusively, not heavily, but as a presence she had made her peace with, the way you make your peace with the things that have shaped you when you finally understand their full shape. She had written to her sister. The letter had taken her 2 weeks to begin and 3 days to write, and had been, in the end, longer than she had expected and more complete than she had hoped. She had told her sister everything: the coach north, the town, the cottage at the end of the Eastern Row, Margaret Aldwell's pale gray eyes, and 60 years of silence finally broken. Thomas Beckles' letter slid under the door of the coaching inn on a gray afternoon. The churchyard in the frost, the unmarked ground beneath the yew trees, the 2 hours in December of 1847 when Margaret had sat with Rose in a cold room and talked about ordinary things. She had written what Margaret had said. She was funny and she was kind and she was braver than any of us gave her credit for, and she had written it carefully and completely, the way Margaret had said it, without reduction, because those words were Rose Whitmore's and they had been owed to her family for 40 years, and Clara was going to deliver them in full. Her sister had written back within a week, a letter that was shorter than Clara's and simpler, the letter of a woman to whom something very important had just been returned after a very long absence, who did not have many words for what she felt but had the ones that mattered. Thank you. She was remembered. She was always ours. The February cold settled into Harrowfield with the particular authority of the second month of the English winter, colder than December, colder than January, the cold that comes when the ground has given up what little warmth it stored in summer and has nothing left to offer the air above it, and the air above it knows it. The high street was quieter than it had been in months, the cold keeping people indoors when indoors was possible, the few figures who moved along it doing so with their heads down and their collars turned up, and the compressed, purposeful gait of people who are somewhere between two warm places and intend to remain there as briefly as possible. The gas lamps burned all morning on the worst days, the sky never lightening past the gray of pre-dawn, and the amber light of them on the frost-white cobblestones had the quality of something both unnecessary and profoundly comforting, the way all light has that quality in the deepest cold, when the darkness is pressing and the warmth of a lamp in a window is the most civilized thing in the world. Margaret Aldwell sat in her chair by her fire and read. She had always been a reader, had been a reader since her father had put the first books in her hands in this same front room 60 years ago, and she read now with the same complete absorption she had always brought to it, the outside world receding when she opened a book the way it recedes for people who have been reading deeply their whole lives, who have learned that the inside of a book is as real a place as the outside of one, and who move between those two realities with a fluency that makes the transition unremarkable. She read in the mornings and the afternoons and the long winter evenings, and she thought reading about Clara Whitmore reading in her Pennsylvania study, and about Rose Whitmore reading in her cold room at the Coaching Inn in the winter of 1847, and about the books Rose had brought with her from Derbyshire, late husband's books, Clara had said, and Margaret had thought about that, about the books a young schoolteacher would have owned in 1847, and had thought that she would like to know what they were, and had thought that she would write to Clara and ask, and had thought that she would do that in the spring, when the writing of letters felt less effortful, and had gone back to her own reading with the comfortable intention of someone who has something pleasant to look forward to. The spring came late to Harrowfield that year, as it often came late in the north, the March cold holding longer than hope suggested it should, and the first signs of thaw appearing only in the last week of the month, tentative and insufficient, a slight softening of the frost in the sunny corner at the south end of the churchyard, a single early crocus in the garden of the Coaching Inn, the quality of the light changing almost imperceptibly from the flat gray of winter to something with a slightly warmer cast, still gray, still flat, but gray in the way of a gray that is considering becoming something else. The starlings in their roost above the butcher's chimney became more vocal. The thin orange cat extended its morning patrol to include the stretch of lane beyond the eastern row that it had declined to visit in the coldest months. Horace Greer began opening his shutters 5 minutes earlier each morning, following the light the way he had followed it every spring for 30 years, adjusting the opening time in increments so small as to be invisible to anyone not paying close attention, which nobody was except Horace himself and possibly the starlings. Margaret wrote her letter to Clara in the first week of April, sitting at the small writing desk in the front room that she had not used for correspondence in several years, the pen slightly unfamiliar in her hand after the long winter's disuse, the words coming slowly and then more easily as the writing resumed its old rhythm. She wrote about the winter, the cold, the long evenings, the reading, the shortbread on Thursdays, the way Harrowfield had been itself through all of it, unchanging and unhurried and entirely occupied with the business of continuing. She wrote about Thomas Beckel, who had been in twice for tea since December, and who was writing something in a notebook that he had not shown her and had not described except to say that it was an account, by which she understood him to mean an honest one, which was the only kind Thomas had ever been capable of. She wrote about Daniel at the coaching inn, who had asked her, on a January afternoon, whether she would be willing to tell him something about the history of the town that the older residents did not discuss, and to whom she had said, after a moment's consideration, "Yes, I think I would." She had not done it yet. She thought she would do it in the spring. She wrote, "I find that I am thinking about Rose differently, not with less weight but with more clarity, as though the telling of it has cleaned the glass through which I see her, if that makes any sense to you. I think it will to you. I think you will know exactly what I mean." The letter reached Pennsylvania in the third week of April, arriving on a Tuesday morning when Clara was at school and waiting on her hall table when she came home in the late afternoon, the familiar precise handwriting of the address unmistakable, the cream envelope slightly thicker than an ordinary letter. She took off her coat and her hat and her gloves and sat down at the kitchen table without going any further into the house and opened it there in the late April light that was coming through the window at the angle it came at this time of year, warm and golden and long, entirely different from the gray November light she associated with Harrowfield, and read it through without stopping. Then she sat for a moment with the letter in her hands and looked out the window at the Pennsylvania afternoon, the bare branches of the elm tree in the garden just beginning to show their first small leaves, the sky a pale clear blue, a robin on the fence post at the end of the path, sitting very still in the late afternoon light. She thought about Margaret Aldwell in the cottage at the end of the eastern row in the spring, with the window open perhaps to let in the first warm air after the long cold winter, the fire burning lower now that the worst was past, the bookshelves familiar and the chair familiar and the view from the window familiar, everything exactly as it had always been and slightly, invisibly, permanently different. She thought about what Margaret had written, "I think you will know exactly what I mean," and thought that she did, that she knew exactly what she meant, that the cleaning of the glass was the right image for it, the seeing more clearly, the carrying more honestly, the difference between a thing you are fighting and a thing you have accepted and the particular quality of rest that comes with that acceptance. She wrote back the same evening, at her desk, by the light of the lamp, with her grandmother's photograph on the desk beside the letter the way it always was now when she wrote at this desk, Rose Whitmore looking out from it with that expression that Clara had been looking at her whole life and had come, in the months since Harrowfield, to see slightly differently, not as the expression of a woman who did not yet know what was coming, which was how she had always seen it before, but as the expression of a woman who was exactly herself in the moment the photograph was taken, completely present, curious, open, entirely real, the way people are real before the things that happen to them have happened, before they become the things that happen to them, when they are simply themselves and the world is simply the world and everything is still possible. Rose Whitmore at 26 in her good dress with her late husband's books and her quality of openness that was simply her nature. Rose Whitmore who was funny in a quiet way and kind without calculation and braver than any of them had given her credit for. Rose Whitmore who had been carrying a bowl of soup to a man eating alone in the cold and had not known that the carrying of it would cost her everything and had carried it anyway because it was the right thing to do, and she was the kind of person who did the right thing not because she had reasoned her way to it but because it was simply what she was, the way a window is simply what it is when it is open to the light. Clara wrote to Margaret about the elm tree and the robin and the particular quality of the Pennsylvania April light. She wrote about her sister's letter and what it had meant to deliver to it what it had been owed for 40 years. She wrote about her students, one of whom had surprised her that week by producing, unprompted, the most precise and honest account of a mathematical problem she had encountered in 20 years of teaching, and about whom she thought there might be, if the world was fair, a very good future. She wrote about rules, about the fact that she had been thinking about them since Harrowfield and had arrived at something she wanted to say about them, which was this: that the unspoken rules of the gaslit age had done what all rules do, which was make the world navigable for most people at the cost of being navigable at all for some people, and that the question of whether any given set of rules is worth that cost is the question that every community has to answer for itself, quietly, honestly, over time, and that the answer changes as the community changes, and that the willingness to revisit the answer, to look at the cost and ask whether it is still worth paying, is perhaps the most important thing a community can do, and that she had come to believe, standing in the churchyard under the yew trees and sitting in the warm cottage across the fire from Margaret Aldwell, that Harrowfield was a community that was beginning, however slowly and however quietly and however incompletely, to revisit the answer. She did not know what the new answer would be. She thought it might take a generation. She thought that was all right. She thought that the beginning was the important thing. She thought that the beginning had already happened. She signed the letter Clara Whitmore, granddaughter of Rose, as she had signed the first one, and sealed it and set it on the hall table to go in the Morning Post, and then sat for a while longer at her desk in the lamplight with her grandmother's photograph in her hands and the Pennsylvania night settling into the garden outside the window, the elm tree dark against the sky, the robin long since gone to wherever robins go when the light fails, the stars beginning to appear above the rooftops, one by one in the cooling April dark. She thought about Margaret reading this letter in the spring cottage, by the fire that was burning lower now, with the window perhaps slightly open to let in the first warm air. She thought about Thomas Beckel writing in his notebook at the kitchen table in the early morning before the post office opened, writing honestly and without excuse about what he had seen and known and done and not done. She thought about Daniel at the coaching and asking Margaret to tell him what the older residents did not discuss, and about Margaret saying, "Yes, I think I would," and about what that telling would mean for Harrowfield, what it would put in the ground alongside all the other things the town had put in the ground over its long, careful, cold, enduring, remarkable, ordinary history. She set the photograph down on the desk and looked at it for a moment longer. Rose Whitmore looked back at her with that expression. Open, curious, present, completely herself. Clara had looked at this photograph her whole life. She would look at it for the rest of her life. It would sit on this desk and on the desks of her sister's children and their children after them, passing down through the family the way important things pass down. Not as a burden but as a presence, not as a wound but as a connection, not as the image of a woman destroyed by the cruelty of a small town in the winter of 1847, but as the image of a woman who was funny and kind and braver than any of them had given her credit for, and who was remembered and who had not been alone and who was not alone now and who would not be alone as long as there was someone in the family who knew her name and spoke it aloud and carried her forward into the future she had not been given but that she deserved, that she had always deserved, that Clara was going to make sure she had. The night settled fully over Pennsylvania. The lamp on the desk burned on. Outside the window the elm tree stood in the dark, and the stars were out in their full April numbers, and the air was the air of a spring night, cool and clean and smelling of the earth beginning again after the long winter, the smell of things starting, the smell of the world deciding to continue. Clara sat at her desk in the lamplight for a little while longer, and then she turned down the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the Pennsylvania night. Different from the sounds of Harrowfield, different clock, different wind, different quality of silence, and felt the day settle into the past the way all days settled, becoming part of the accumulation of days that made a life, becoming part of the story that would eventually be all that was left of any of them, becoming part of the long patient record of everything that had ever happened and been felt and been survived and been carried forward by people who had decided, in the face of everything, to keep going, to keep speaking, to keep carrying what needed to be carried, to keep the names of the ones who deserved to be remembered alive in the mouths of the ones who were still here to remember them. The gas lamps of Harrowfield burned on through the spring nights, amber and patient and steady, the same lamps on the same cobblestones in the same street that had been there since before any of them were born and would be there long after all of them were gone. The cottage at the end of the eastern row was warm with firelight. The post office on the high street was quiet in the early mornings. A man at a desk writing carefully in a small notebook by the light of an oil lamp before the day began. The old Aldwell house stood at the end of the lane with its overgrown garden and its empty rooms and its door that opened now more easily than it once had. And in the dust of the mantelpiece in the front room the faint rectangular outline was still there, barely visible now in the spring light that came through the filmed windows, fading but not yet gone, the lightest possible evidence of something that had been there and was now somewhere else, something that had come a long way to stand in that room for 10 minutes and had left behind it, in the dust, in the town, in the hearts of the few people who knew what it had come for, the mark of a presence that had mattered and that was not going to be forgotten. The fire in Margaret Aldwell's cottage burned low on the last evening of the long winter, as it burned low every evening at this hour, the coals settling into themselves with the quiet sounds of a fire at the end of its work, the orange deepening to red and the red deepening to the dark warm glow of embers that give their heat more gently and more honestly than flames. Margaret sat in her chair and watched the fire do this the way she watched it every evening, with the particular quality of attention that very old people sometimes bring to ordinary things. Complete, unhurried, appreciative in a way that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the accumulated understanding of someone who has lived long enough to know the value of ordinary warmth. She was tired in the good way, the way you are tired at the end of a day that has required something of you that you were able to give. She thought about Rose Whitmore's face in the photograph. She thought about Clara's hand in hers. She thought about the words she had said. She was funny and she was kind and what we did was wrong, and she felt them settle into her the way the truth settles when it has finally been spoken, not lightly, not without weight, but with the particular solidity of something that is now outside you and in the world and real in a way it could not be while it remained inside. She closed her eyes. The fire breathed its last warmth into the room. Outside the window the gas lamp burned on the empty path and the frost was gone from the cobblestones now and the town of Harrowfield was settling into its spring night with the unhurried completeness of a place that has been settling into its nights for centuries and has learned how to do it without remainder, without residue, without anything left over that cannot be absorbed into the dark and held there quietly until morning. The clock on the church tower struck 10. The sound of it moved through the still air of the town, with the same clear resonance it always had. Over the rooftops and through the yew trees and into the churchyard where the frost had finally released its hold on the ground near the east wall, and over the high street where the last lamp was burning, and into the coaching inn where Daniel was banking the fires for the night, and up to the room on the second floor where Clara Whitmore had spent a week and where the nightstand was bare now of everything except the faint rectangular shadow of a thing that had stood there and was now somewhere else, somewhere it belonged, somewhere it was kept and honored and looked at and spoken to on the evenings when its keeper sat at her desk in the Pennsylvania lamplight and thought about the town of Harrowfield and the women who had lived and died in it, and the long, patient, unstoppable work of remembering that goes on long after the events that require it have passed. Down the eastern row the cottage at the end was warm and still, the fire low, the lamp extinguished, the window giving back to the night outside only the faint reflection of the gas lamp on the path. A small amber point in the dark glass, steady and warm and entirely sufficient. And beyond the cottage at the end of the row, in the lane that led to the old Aldwell house, the night was entirely still, the house quiet in its stones, the garden beginning its slow spring return to something ordered and tended and cared for, the door that opened easily now, the cold clean spring air moving through the overgrown paths in a way that was barely a wind and was closer to the idea of renewal than renewal itself, a suggestion of beginning, a suggestion of the world deciding to go on, which was what the world always decided in the end, which was the only decision the world had ever made, patient and indifferent and unstoppable, and in its patience and its indifference and its unstoppable continuity, beautiful. In Harrowfield, as in all places touched by time and the long patience of those who remember, everything at last grew still.